In January 1964, in the grips of the Zanzibar Revolution, tens of thousands of Arabs and light-skinned people were massacred on the tiny island of Zanzibar off the coast of Tanzania. To this day, the gruesome event remains largely outside the public eye and is very rarely discussed or talked about. Some call it the unspoken genocide. However, there is actual video footage showing the massacre. It was filmed by some Italians making the documentary Africa Audio. But more on this later. No apology has ever been issued, and little remorse has been shown for this atrocity. In fact, each year, the Zanzibar Revolution is publicly celebrated on its anniversary as a successful uprising against slavery and oppression. For us to truly understand why such an abhorrent act of genocide occurred, we need to go all the way back to Zanzibar's early beginnings as a slave trading hub. As early as the 9th century, Persian, Indian, and Arab traders frequented Zanzibar to acquire goods like gold, ivory, spices, and of course slaves from the local people. Fairly standard practice in that era. Then in 1503 the Portuguese rocked up during their first era of empire building. Captain Lawrence Marcus came ashore with great aplomb and received tribute from the Sultan in exchange for peace. Tribute in this case meant handing your island over to the Portuguese Empire. And so, for the next 200 years, Zanzibar remained under Portuguese control. The Portuguese never established a settlement in Zanzibar, but rather used it as a stopover point for their fleets traveling between India and East Africa. They levied taxes and duties on local trade, particularly on the export of slaves and ivory, which were in high demand in Portuguese colonies in the Indian Ocean and the Americas. But controlling the Swahili coast came at a cost. Both local rulers and external powers wanted a piece of the action. Most notably the Omanis, who turned up in the early 17th century. They saw the value the entire Swahili coast could add to their empire. And so they launched a series of attacks on Portuguese-controlled ports along the East African coast and eventually drove the Portuguese out of Zanzibar and much of the surrounding coast. And so began 200 years of Omani rule. Zanzibar became a critical part of the Omani Empire's growing influence over the Indian Ocean trade. The Omanis focused on securing the coastal cities and linking them to their Arabian homeland, both through expanding the trade of cloves and slaves. After cloves were introduced by Omani settlers, they quickly transformed Zanzibar's economy and became the island's most important export after slaves. The Omanis didn't mess around when it came to the slave trade. They made a fortune off it. Slaves were brought from the East African hinterland as far as the Congo Basin and sold across the Indian Ocean to markets in Arabia, Persia, and as far as India. Zanzibar became one of the largest slave markets in the world, with thousands of Africans passing through the island each year. The slave trade under Omani rule was brutal, with Tipu Tip being one of the most notorious slave traders in history. Link in the description for a video on him. So as you can imagine, it didn't take long for a certain level of disdain and resentment to develop from the locals toward the Omanis, as the native people were being treated as subhumans. The wealthy Omani elites were continuing to build tremendous wealth, all at the expense of the Swahilis. After the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in 1807, the British pressured Sultan Bargash to end slavery in Zanzibar, which he did eventually in 1873. At this point, the Omanis lost interest in Zanzibar, and it eventually became a British protectorate in 1890 during the scramble for Africa. Zanzibar's location along key maritime routes in the Indian Ocean made it a valuable strategic port for Britain, particularly in securing its naval supremacy and protecting its interests in India and East Africa. Under the British, and with slavery now gone, Zanzibar's economy remained heavily reliant on clove production. The international market for cloves was volatile, leading to periods of economic boom and bust. Over the centuries, Zanzibari society had grown to become multicultural, including Arabs, many of whom were descended from the Omani ruling class. Swahili-speaking Africans, South Asians, mostly from the Indian subcontinent, and smaller numbers of Europeans. All seemed good and well. However, By the mid-20th century, anti-colonial sentiment was sweeping across Africa, and Zanzibar would soon become a key proponent of this. By the 1950s, social tensions were mounting due to the economic inequalities between different ethnic groups. The Arab elite controlled most of the clove plantations. The South Asian community played a key role in commerce and trade, and were also doing well for themselves, while the African population, though the majority, was largely marginalized and worked as laborers. For the local Swahilis, nothing had really changed. They were still at the bottom of the barrel. Zanzibar began negotiating with Great Britain for independence. In 1963, after years of political agitation, the British finally granted Zanzibar independence. Unfortunately, this newfound independence marked the start of pandemonium in the country. Just 1 month after gaining independence, the island was rocked by the Zanzibar Revolution. On the 12th January 1964, leader of the Afro-Shirazi Party, John Okello, along with many other discontented Africans, stormed Zanzibar's capital, Stone Town, and overthrew Sultan Jamshid bin Abdullah. You see, John Okello, a Ugandan by birth, was part of the Christian minority in Zanzibar, and was treated disrespectfully by the Muslims because of this. This motivated him to form an uprising against them. Even though slavery had ended in Zanzibar over 90 years ago, its legacy still lived on. The Arab elite still saw themselves as superior to the black Swahilis, and they did little to hide their racism. In Parliament, the Minister of Finance Juma Ali responded to questions from Abai Karum by insultingly saying he need not answer questions from a mere boatman. Ali further explained in another speech in Parliament that if Arabs were overrepresented in the cabinet, it was not because of race, but rather because the mental abilities of blacks were so abysmally low and the mental abilities of Arabs, like himself, were so high. A remark that enraged the black majority. So by the time the revolution happened, the black Zanzibaris were fed up with being treated as second-rate citizens. When John Okello and his men arrived at the Sultan's palace, armed with only spears, knives and machetes, they were able to overpower the Sultan's guards by their sheer numbers. And within a few hours, the Sultan and his family had escaped. Other cabinet ministers and senior government officials were not so lucky. With Okello now having control of the palace, his next target was Ziwani Police HQ, the largest armory on the island. Okello personally attacked a police sentry, wrestled his rifle from him, and used it to bayonet the policeman to death. The rest of his men proceeded to kill the other policemen and take control of their guns. Arming themselves with hundreds of captured automatic rifles, submachine guns and Bren guns, the insurgents took control of strategic buildings in the capital. From there, Okello made his way to the local radio station, which had been captured 2 hours earlier. He proceeded to make a chilling broadcast calling upon the Africans to rise up and overthrow the imperialists. This incendiary speech resulted in chaos erupting across the island within a matter of hours. Marauding gangs assembled across the island. Motivated by racial hatred and promises of wealth and women, enraged African militiamen went from house to house, murdering, torturing, and raping every Arab they could lay their hands on. Arab properties were expropriated. Many other homes were invaded and people of lighter skin were targeted for extermination, often in a brutal manner. Bloody corpses quickly filled the streets of Zanzibar. Mutilated bodies became a common sight. Allegedly, Okello bragged that he personally killed over 8,000 people in the massacre. Throughout Stone Town, rebels looted and destroyed shops and homes owned by Arabs and South Asians, and gang-raped numerous Arab and South Asian women. The next few days were absolute carnage on the streets. Not knowing that Okello had given orders to kill no whites, the Americans living in Stone Town fled to the English Club, a demarcated evacuation point. Those traveling in the car convoy to the English Club were shocked to see the battered bodies of Arab men lying out on the streets of Stone Town with their severed penises and testicles shoved into their mouths. The large-scale execution and burial of Arabs in mass graves was documented by an Italian crew, filming from a helicopter for Africa Audio. You can see the endless lines of Arabs being marched to their graves. This footage is the only known visual documentation of the killings. As they fly up above, you can clearly see the rebels shooting at them from below. In total, the Arab massacre lasted around a week, with the most brutal violence happening in the last 3 days. The total death toll is largely disputed, but experts say it's between 10 and 20,000. The lucky survivors were forced into exile. Some even became refugees in the UK, like the Sultan himself.